be here today. I'll go ahead and get right into it. So a few months ago, my wife had taken her wedding ring to our local jeweler to get cleaned. We'd been there many times before. It's where we bought our wedding rings, and being a jeweler, they of course have many high-priced items inside. As my wife was waiting for her ring to get cleaned, which only takes a few minutes, she overheard one of the sales associates speaking with someone on the phone. Now, in addition to nice jewelry, this place also happens to sell Rolex watches. And the person on the phone was interested in buying a watch, and the salesperson was going over what they had available. The customer on the phone had narrowed down their choice to one Rolex watch in particular. The sales associate then started going over the financial details of this watch. What my wife heard next was a little shocking. The cost of the watch was $75,000. Now, in the world of watches, believe it or not, this is probably on the low end compared to what you might find at some upscale store in Beverly Hills or in New York City. But still, $75,000 is a lot for a watch. You could buy 2 or 3 brand new cars for that. A small house maybe even. A college education. You could buy so many other things in a watch that most people probably won't even see. Now, a little disclaimer here. I'm in no way shaming anyone that likes to buy or have nice or expensive things. There's nothing wrong with owning a $75,000 watch if you can afford that. There's no issue there. I'd like to ask a question though. Are you happy? Are you happy? Ever since my wife told me this story, I kept wondering if the person buying that watch was happy, and if they were trying to perhaps buy happiness. Was that person happy with their life? Or could they possibly be discontent in some way, looking for things, status, and notice from their peers to create their happiness? It's so easy to get caught up in all the things that this world offers, all the gadgets, the trinkets, the flashy items. It's nice to have, and it does create happiness to a certain extent. But we have to remember one very important thing. It doesn't last forever, and it doesn't bring long-term, meaningful happiness. I think Ecclesiastes 2, 24 through 26 really nails this point right on the head. I'll just read it here. I'm reading from the New International Version. It says, "A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too I see is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth, to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind." Meaningless, chasing the wind. It reminds me of when you open up your car door and there's a plastic grocery bag in it and it blows out and you start running after it. Maybe you could catch it, maybe you can't. Makes you realize how easy a physical possession can simply blow away though. Along with any happiness it brought to you, it's simply fleeting. You probably all know who Steve Jobs is. He was the founder of Apple. And if you own a touchscreen smartphone, he's pretty much responsible for bringing that innovation to you. He's an extremely successful man, very wealthy, smart, passionate about life. He passed away in 2011 from pancreatic cancer. And this man could have had anything he wanted. He was one of the wealthiest people in the world. He's credited with a very profound quote, though, that really shows how he knew that there was something else besides money and success to give meaning and a kind of happiness and fulfillment to his life. That quote was, he said, "Being the richest man in the cemetery doesn't matter to me. Going to bed at night saying we've done something wonderful, that's what matters to me." The richest man in the cemetery. What a goal, right? Now, Steve Jobs, for all we know, don't think he had God's Spirit yet. He hadn't been called out and given the insight that we have. But yet, you can tell from that quote that he was searching for greater meaning in life. He understood that there was something more than the pursuit of money that gave his life meaning, that made him happy and gave him purpose overall. This coming from a man who had everything, could have had everything. And there are unfortunately a lot of people out there who don't know God yet. We all have friends out in the world. What are their goals? Are they truly happy? Or do they work for the weekend parties? Do they work for that drink after work? Are they money hungry, unable to be satisfied? When they're not in the public light, are they happy? Is their outside appearance a facade to cover up their inner turmoil? Since our eyes have been opened to God's ultimate plan for mankind, our perspective on life should be quite different than the average person you'd see on the street. Our drive for happiness is derived by means of living the way God has instructed us to live. And as my wife and I begin to raise our daughter, we understand that there are natural consequences and natural rewards that she will experience in life. Consequences of breaking God's laws will naturally bring trials associated with that. But if she obeys God's laws, she will ultimately be a happier person one day. It's simple. Do this and you'll avoid being hurt. Do this and you'll put yourself in harm's way. God doesn't want us to suffer, to go through trials brought on by our own behavior. In Matthew 11, verse 29 says it best, I think. It says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." It's one of my favorite scriptures. The yoke is easy, the burden is light. It will create happiness. Do we want to fight God, thinking that we know better, and think happiness will be found living life the way that we want? That ultimately doesn't bring happiness. God's rules create a sustainable life for us to live. He says, do this and you'll be happy. Do this and you'll thrive. Do this and you won't get hurt. Why would we push back against what God wants when our well-being is such a high priority for him? Obeying his commandments, the Sabbath, holy days, going to the feast, treating each other with respect, having a godly attitude and a spirit of service and humility, having greater inner meaning and happiness as a result because we know that there is a future beyond this physical life. We have a goal. God's way of life and his rules are in place not only for our well-being, but for our happiness. He wants us to enjoy life and be happy. But true happiness can only come from following his guidebook, the Bible. Without that, we have no direction. We're blind without it, stumbling around in the dark, unable to see. We've seen a lot of change this past year. COVID has certainly left its mark on families. So many deaths. We've had riots. We've had countless people get laid off and lose their jobs. So at some points, we've even been unable to worship together. And it may not even be done yet. It's certainly a time all of us will remember. All this culminates to creating more discontent, though, more frustration, desperation, and depression. There are a lot of unhappy people out there right now, aren't there? Without God's Spirit, these trials can lead us into some dark paths. People try to find happiness in unhealthy ways. This can be drugs, it could be alcohol, it can be some sort of harmful activity that does nothing to help you in the long term. Sure, it might bring some distraction possibly, but ultimately not long-term happiness. We know what we have to do to create happiness. We have to live God's way of life with his rules in place. But I want to point out some specific things we can do to maintain our happiness in this life and keep a perspective to appreciate the happiness we're currently able to attain. So this leads me into my first point today. I have 3 points. It says the first point is remember the basics. Remember the basics. There are many people who don't even have a roof over their head. Maybe they don't have good health. Maybe they don't have food or running water. Perhaps simply getting up and walking can be a chore. For a person who was never able to walk, imagine how overjoyed they'd be if they could suddenly run a marathon. For someone suffering a health trial, I think the last thing that they're thinking of is how awesome it would be to drive that new Cadillac home or buy that $75,000 watch. I'd imagine that their goal would be to get out of the hospital as quickly as possible. A thing as simple and yet complicated as good health could be all that it takes to create happiness. Our perspective really does play a part in this. When you experience close friends, family, or yourself suffering through health trials, physical possessions go out the window in these cases. You go through a spiritual reality check. All of the stuff becomes the least of your concerns. It's absolutely meaningless, and it doesn't create true happiness. Happiness ends up becoming able to walk out of the hospital and smelling the fresh air and seeing the sunshine. Don't forget the basics of being happy, because one day that may be all that you are left with. The second point is laziness does not equal happiness. Laziness does not equal happiness. Happiness doesn't simply happen. It is something that we create with God's guidance. And if you refuse to get up in the morning, refuse to go to work, refuse to obey your parents, refuse to fulfill your responsibilities, the consequences of those actions will follow. Spouses will get fed up with that behavior. Employers will only give you so many chances to miss work. Parents may remove privileges. If laziness is what holds our chances back for happiness, then we need to address that immediately. God's dislike of laziness is backed up by Scripture. And in Proverbs 13, verse 4, it says, "The soul of a lazy man desires and has nothing, but the soul of the diligent shall be made rich." My third and last point today is be thankful. Be thankful. Being thankful for what we do have and realizing that everything comes through God helps us keep things in perspective. We are only here because God has blessed us with the ability to be here. What we have is because of what God has blessed us with. Yet, yes, we must do our part, but God is ultimately responsible for our blessings. So let's remember to be thankful. Being thankful helps us learn to be happy and content with the blessings that we have. So remember how to be happy. Remember what truly brings us happiness. Not putting too much stock in worldly possessions. They are fun and may bring happiness for a little while, but long-term spiritual happiness is only achieved through living life the way God has instructed us to live. Are you happy?